Pose 322. Study Session 6. Pan-Africanism, Meaning and Evolution. Introduction. Like nationalism, which was examined in the previous lecture, Pan-Africanism, which is examined in the next two lectures, is both an idea and a movement, an aspect of African thoughts and their location within the global system, and a call to action to bring about the unity of Africans in Africa and their descendants in the diaspora, that is, basically descendants of Africans sold into slavery and now living in the Africans and West Indies and also in Europe. In this lecture, we shall focus on the origin and essence of Pan-Africanism as a movement. The lecture ends with a general background of key Pan-African exponents such as James Hudson, James Johnson, Edward Blyden, Dred Padmore, and William Du Bois. In the next lecture, we shall examine in more detail the conditions of each of these figures. Learning outcomes. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to discuss Pan-Africanism and outline the context in which key Pan-African writers made their contribution to Pan-Africanism. It is hoped that at the end of the lecture, you would be able to define Pan-Africanism and identify the historical and social context of the contributions of various writers to the idea and practice of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is that aspect of African political thought that emphasizes the cultural unity of Africa and therefore pledges itself to bringing about the unification of Africa at the political level. As Esebede, an analyst, has put it, the major strands of thought in Pan-Africanism include 1. The notion that Africa is the homeland of all Africans and persons of African descent in other parts of the world. 2. A commitment to bringing about a united and great Africa. 3. The need to bring about and sustain solidarity among peoples of African stock wherever they may be. 4. Believe in an African personality distinct from all others. 5. Respect for and the glorification of African culture and traditions in church, state, and society. And lastly, the regeneration of Africa. You may have noted from the above that as an idea, Pan-Africanism as an idea expresses not just what exists on the ground, that is what is, but also what in its own perspective could be done to improve on that which exists, that is what ought to be. To that extent, Pan-Africanism not only describes and explains, it also expresses a wish about the desired state of affairs concerning Africa and peoples of African stock. In this regard, as will be clear shortly, it has informed the action of statesmen and scholars of African stock on the continent and abroad in their search for a continental unity and pride that continues to be elusive. It is no wonder that a non-African observer, Kasem Sada, has noted of Pan-Africanism that it is rather an affirmation of a unity that does not exist. Pan-Africanism is used for political purposes by the governments of the various African states, but as yet, it exercises no appreciable influence on their policies. Before we move on to the next section of this lecture, I want you to think about Kasem Sada's view on Pan-Africanism. Looking at the reality of contemporary Africa, how fair is the observation that Pan-Africanism has remained a pious dream of African unity? Write an essay of about 50 words on this issue. According to Badejo 2008, the Pan-African movement of the 1950s and early 1960s focused on 4 pillars. 1. The recognition that African nationalism had to be Pan-Africanism, that territorial nationalism built within countries whose boundaries had been artificially drawn by colonial masters was both unreal and unviable. 2. Pan-Africanism was consistently anti-imperialist. Pan-Africanism was conceived and perceived as a political project or movement. 4. Pan-Africanists were persistent in their stand that African unity would be a voluntary act and that it could not be imposed. Perspectives on Pan-Africanism. As indicated earlier on, Pan-Africanism is both an idea and a program of action. As an idea, It originated among writers of African descent in the New World, that is, America, and Europe in the 18th century. It was not until the last decade of the 19th century that it became transformed into a political movement, thanks to the initiative of people of African descent, principally in Europe and America, who began to summon international conferences on Pan-Africanism and to organize themselves into pressure groups for the purpose of achieving some of the goals of the idea of Africanism. What I now attempt below is to identify the general background of the principal actors in this drama, pointing out the context in which they wrote and acted. In the next lecture, I examine the extent of their individual contributions to Pan-Africanism. Key Pan-African exponents. General background. Some of these exponents include James Hutton, James Johnson, Edward Blyden, George Padmore, and William Du Bois. Before we go on, I want you to check your history books and other relevant texts for information on these people. Using the data so collected, write a 2-page essay on each of them. One thing that is striking about these early contributors to Pan-Africanism is the uniformly hostile American social background against which they propounded their ideas. As a commentator has observed, the humiliating and discriminating experiences of the Africans in diaspora, the racism that accompanied the campaign for the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade, the independent African church movement, as well as European imperialism, all represent the main sources of and conditions giving rise to Pan-African consciousness and ideas. Study session summary. Pan-Africanism as an idea calls for a continental union of African states and rejects the continued balkanization and marginalization of Africa. It has led to a movement committed to the achievement of this goal. End of study session 6. Thank you for listening.